Yes, one of the most powerful examples of how patient advocates overcome enormous challenges. And the same is definitely true for our next speaker. She's from Cuba, and of course, I'm sure you're all aware of the history of Cuba. What I wasn't aware of until I read about Tania Crombet was that apparently still there are a lot of restrictions in Cuba, and they don't have the right to get all sorts of medications because they're from abroad. My first emotion here was surprise, but that very quickly turned into awe when I heard what Tania Crombet is doing about that. So please come to the stage and show us what patient advocates do when they have to face these kind of challenges.
Oh, should I open it here? Oh, thank you very much. So, is it open it? So thank you very much for the invitation. I feel really privileged and honored to have been invited here. Okay, thank you very much. So I think, yeah, this is here. Okay. So I will be describing briefly what we are doing in Cuba in spite of the economical restrictions. So once more, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Ilona, for asking me to be part of this gorgeous family. So the topics I will be addressing in my presentation are related with the health system in Cuba. Then I would be describing how is the cancer situation now in Cuba, and particularly what we are doing regarding the cancer control program. And finally, I would be briefly showing you what we are doing regarding the biotech and pharmaceutical industry to somehow overcome many challenges that we have to face. So the health system in Cuba. So before I have to start clarifying that in Cuba, even though we are a very poor country, we do have universal health coverage. Of course, all the hospitals are public, and we have free medical attention. So we have the right to receive whatever is available in our country. So and the system is based mostly on the primary care system. So the orientation is to prevent diseases. So I would say that Cuba is famous on account of the medical doctors. So we have roughly 80,000 medical doctors in Cuba. And even though we do have 80,000 medical doctors, there are many students in the medical school. So we have one medical university per provinces. So I would say that Cuba has one of the highest physician population ratio. So it is roughly 79 medical doctors per 10,000 inhabitants. And regarding some statistics that reflects how is the system helping the population, I would say that the infant mortality is 7 per 1,000 live birth, even though it was much lower before the COVID-19 pandemics. In the rest of the world is 26 now, so 7 is rather impressive for our economical restrictions. So the country has eliminated 14 infectious diseases. So the population in Cuba is vaccinated again, these 14 infectious diseases, and the majority of these vaccines are being manufactured in Cuba. And for example, Cuba was the first country to be certified by the WHO to eliminate the mother-to-child transmission of HIV and syphilis. And for example, this is the life expectancy, and the life expectancy is roughly 78. That compares very favorably with the rest of the world, and it is much higher than the low-income countries and African countries. And for example, I am just showing what we did during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I have to clarify that we do have an US embargo, a blockade that was imposed in 1962. So we cannot buy any drug in the US, or we cannot sell either any drug in the US, so we do not have access to any of the COVID vaccines. So we didn't have the Moderna or Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson vaccine, so we have to develop our own vaccines. So indeed, we developed 5 vaccine candidates, including one mucosal vaccine. And among these 5 vaccine candidates, 3 of them were approved already. And for example, in the phase 3 trials that we did, we enrolled more than 48,000 patients, or normal subjects, or in the second vaccine that was Soberana, we enrolled more than 44,000 normal subjects. So we did a good job regarding vaccination. And for example, this is the last time I checked our holding data regarding the number of vaccines doses that we have received. So Cuba is also among the countries with the highest vaccine rate regarding COVID. And I have to say that once we started vaccinating the population, COVID-19 was completely controlled. And then we even started vaccinating the children. We were the first country to vaccinate the children after 2 years old. And for example, cancer. So we used to say that we live like a poor country, but we die like in the rich country. So cancer is the second leading cause of death. So in Cuba, we're roughly 10 million population. This is the last statistical information, but there are 25,000 deaths every year on account of cancer. So I would say that 1 in 4 deaths can be attributed to cancer in our country nowadays. So we have a huge burden of cancer because the population is aging. And regarding premature mortality, cancer is the first cause of premature mortality. So I would say that 1/3 of all the premature mortality is due to cancer in my country. So regarding what we are doing, we do have a comprehensive national program for cancer control that started in 1964. So we have a national registry for cancer, which is among the oldest in the continent. But in 1966, it was very important because the National Institute of Oncology and Radiobiology was created. And then there was a network for cancer patients. So we established a network for connecting all the institutions devoted to cancer. And after that, there have been many programs to establish the early detection of several tumor types, including cervical cancer detection, of course, cytology at the beginning. The Papa Nicolau, the conventional cytology, but also we have a screening program for oral cancer, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, prostate cancer. So, and now we have, for example, what we call the Comprehensive Control Program that was established in 2007, and it's been updated periodically. So regarding the National Registry, I think that this is very important because it's assisting and helping decision makers regarding the drugs and how to deal with the cancer burden. And I have to say this is among the oldest population-based registry in the continent, Latin America and the Caribbean. And it is one of the register with the largest population coverage. And this is very important for us. And so we do have a cancer essential drug list in Cuba. So I am describing somehow how we select. So in Cuba, we have a national group of oncology. So I am a member of this national group of oncology, and how we select which are the drugs that we are going to be including in this national formulary. So we have to consider firstly, which is the prevalence of the different tumor types. Then we have to calculate which are the needs according to the National Registry data, according to the staging of the different cancer types. And then we have to classify the malignant tumors according to the curability, which is the probability of success of using several drugs. And then, of course, we compared our essential formulary with the WHO essential medicine list. So somehow we are trying to compliance. But of course, we cannot access the recent US drugs because, since I have said before, so it is completely forbidden for us since 1962. So after Kennedy decreed the blockade to buy anything in the US. So truly speaking, we have to wait until the patent expires to have access to the drugs. Even, to have the generic drugs or even biosimilars in the case of biologics. So our main, approach is to make incentives for the national industry. So I am working in the pharmaceutical industry in Cuba. And then we have to introduce high quality generics and biosimilars. And once we introduce these high quality generics and biosimilars, we can allocate these import substitution resources to incorporate new drugs and to somehow cover the Cuban population. And of course, we do update our treatment guidelines, so using the evidence-based medicine. So now I will describe the BioCuba Pharma industry. So BioCuba Pharma is the holding of enterprises that somehow groups all the biotech industry and the pharmaceutical industry in Cuba. I have to say that this BioCuba Pharma is composed by 32 different enterprises, and we have 80 manufacturing facilities, and we are roughly 15,000 workers. And our responsibility is to grant coverage of, I would say, 70% of the national formulary, not only regarding cancer, but the rest of the medicines also included in this national formulary. So, of course, we have to comply with the good manufacturing practices. So those are some images of the facilities that we have in Cuba. So you can see that, I mean, because we're also exporting to several countries, mainly in the south, so we have to receive periodical inspections, so we have to comply with GMP, which is good manufacturing practices. And for example, we are also transferring the technology to the south, because this is the way to grant independence for them. So those are some of the examples that we have transferred in the south. For example, Biomanguinho in Brazil, or in Brazil, yes. We built a factory in Rio, and also to Venezuela, Vietnam, Iran, in China. We have 2 manufacturing facilities that we have built together with the Chinese people. To South Africa also. So it is a policy of Cuba to transfer the technology to the south whenever it's possible. And then, for example, I will refer briefly to my institution. So I work for an institution named the Center of Molecular Immunology. And the Center of Molecular Immunology is one of the leading institutions on this biotech industry in Cuba. And this is the institution devoted to cancer research and basically cancer immunotherapy. So the founding staff from the institution were, the research staff from the National Institute of Oncology. So I could say that we have a very close connection with the Ministry of Health. But what distinguishes our institution regarding the manufacturing technology is that we do mammalian cell culture. So mammalian cell culture is important to produce recombinant proteins, provided that we are producing basically antibodies and antigens for the cancer vaccines and cytokines, for example. So we do have a national CRO to make the clinical trials in Cuba. And regarding the type of research that we are doing, I would say that 80% is cancer research, mainly immunotherapy, as I have said before. So we were among the believers on cancer immunotherapy since the early 90s. So we have been working around antibodies and cytokines and bispecific antibodies since many years ago. But it is not only cancer, we're also dealing with some autoimmune diseases, because provided that this is immunotherapy, we can try also some inflammatory diseases. So we have many research around psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, but also recently we have incorporated neurodegenerative disorders in our research portfolio. So we are trying some drugs for Alzheimer's disease. So we also have a huge burden of Alzheimer's disease in Cuba, and ataxias and Parkinson's disease and stroke. So this is the type of research. So again, 80% is cancer, but now we're expanding to other needs of the Cuban population. So provided that we need to produce whatever we need, my institution has been producing biosimilars for a while. So we incorporated erythropoietin and GCSF because this was important to grant compliance of the chemotherapy for the patient population. So we registered erythropoietin for the chronic kidney diseases since early 90s, and then GCSF in 2002. And this was very important. Otherwise, it has been impossible for us to have it. And recently, we have decided to produce 2 anti-PD-1 antibodies because we do acknowledge that these anti-PD-1 antibodies are a breakthrough regarding cancer immunotherapy. So we do not have access to nivolumab or pembro. So we have to wait once more until the patent expires. So provided that they were not patented in Cuba by Bristol Myers Squibb or Merck, which are the big pharma producing this anti-PD-1 antibody, we have decided to copy these anti-PD-1s and we are ready to produce it. So indeed, the mammalian cells are already transfected with the gene producing the 2 anti-PD-1 antibodies, and we are producing already nivolumab in the small fermenters, and we're confident that we're going to be starting the evaluation trial in 2025.
And so I will try to describe briefly what we're doing regarding innovative drugs. So since early 90s, I would say that we have developed one anti-EGF receptor antibody. So there are many, there are others anti-EGF receptor antibodies like cetuximab or panitumumab approved in the market, but ours is one of the best in its class. So EGF receptor is one of the best it's a very well validated target in oncology because it is pretty much expressed by many epithelia derived tumors. So it mediates proliferation, metastasis, angiogenesis, apoptosis inhibition. So we do have a humanized antibody. So at the beginning, we started by a murine antibody that we have to humanize by genetic engineering, and this humanized antibody has an intermediate affinity, so that grants that somehow preferentially recognize the tumor cells and not the normal tissues that also can express the EGF receptor. So this humanized antibody, it's been approved in 30 countries now, not only in Cuba, and it is approved for several indications in combination with the standard chemotherapy or radiotherapy. And for example, it is approved for tumors with still a very poor prognosis, including pancreatic cancer, glioblastoma, even in children or in the adult population, in NPC, nasopharyngeal tumors. So in China, for example, this is the entry indication. And we have also proven that the antibody is also exerting what we call a vaccinal effect. So it's more than a passive immunotherapy. So we have demonstrated that after using this antibody repeatedly, we can induce a T-cell response. This is very important because we can somehow spread the response against some tumor antigens. And for example, this is one of the famous Cuban cancer vaccines. So I have to say that it is based on the same target, but instead of targeting directly the receptor, we are trying to target the ligand, one of the most important ligands, which is the EGF. EGF means epidermal growth factor. So what we're doing is having a recombinant protein, which is EGF, coupled to another recombinant protein from a meningitis B bacteria in order to become very immunogenic, the vaccine formulation, and we are using an adjuvant. And the intention is to induce antibodies against this growth factor for the tumors, while this is a representation of what the vaccine is doing, while we induce depletion or a deprivation of the EGF, and somehow we are expanding the hormone dependence concept. So this is very well validated, as you know, the hormone dependence concept for prostate cancer or breast cancer, but we have validated that for lung cancer, it is the EGF can behave as an important growth hormone. So we have done a lot of research since the early 2000. So, and this is a summary of the phase 3 study where this was before the anti-PD-1's approval. So we used the vaccine in the non-small cell lung cancer scenario, and we use it as a switch maintenance. So after patients completed the frontline chemotherapy and they were treated with the vaccine or the supportive care, that was the recommended therapy at that time. So at the same time, we have proven that the EGF can behave as a prognostic biomarker. So the patients with non-small cell lung cancer that do have a very high EGF concentration does have the worst prognosis, but at the same time, we can anticipate a better outcome if they receive the EGF vaccine. So the survival rate after being vaccinated for the patients with the very high EGF concentration, that means that the tumors depend on the EGF, would be living for, 23% of the patients would be alive, after 5 years. So I'm talking about non-small cell lung cancer. And you know that the prognosis is very poor in this indication also. And the good news is that after we have the approval of this cancer vaccine in Cuba, which is approved in some other countries also, we decided to use the vaccine in the primary care setting. So the vaccine was so safe that it is not needed to go to the hospitals or the tertiary care level institutions to receive the vaccination. So, and provided that it is a self-antigen, so it was a challenge to break the tolerance and to induce a very potent response. We have to use repeated vaccination, booster vaccination. So we decided that the optimal scenario to use the vaccine was the primary care. So we granted better compliance if we somehow administered the vaccine in the polyclinics. So now in Cuba, we have done 2 phase 4 studies in the primary care setting. So now more than 100 polyclinics are prescribing this vaccine. And besides, we're evaluating the EGF concentration in the serum. So somehow this is the precision medicine. So even though this is not the oncogene itself, but it is the protein. So it is very easily to measure the EGF in serum. And we're also using electronic case report forms, which is probably very well established in your countries, but in our country, it was complicated. And then, for example, now we are somehow breaking the blockade because there was, almost done. Yeah. So we are doing also trials in the US because there were some physicians in the US that were very interested in trying this cancer vaccine. So we have now a JV, a joint venture with the hospital in Buffalo, the Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. So we are doing 3 trials in the US now in colorectal cancer, in the preventive scenario, and also in the lung cancer scenario. This is the data from even though the vaccine was approved in Cuba, we have to do a phase 1 in the US, provided that we were going to combine the vaccine with an anti-PD-1 antibody. And for example, this is the paper from the phase 1. We validated what we have seen in Cuba. The vaccine was very immunogenic, was even more immunogenic. After combining with an anti-PD-1 antibody, we deplete the EGF, and the survival data was pretty much encouraging with this is the very small patient population, but the phase 2 seems to be validating the same results that we got in the phase 1. And for example, I was trying to show you the newcomers drugs. This is an interleukin-2 mutant. So interleukin-2 was approved for several indications before, kidney disease, kidney cancer, and melanoma. But we have to decide to mutate this interleukin-2 in order to be less toxic and more efficacious. Because, this interleukin-2 mutant, for example, has, by mathematical modeling, that's a specific avoidance of the recognition of the alpha chain of the interleukin-2 receptor. So somehow it's simulating the effector T cells and the NK cells and not the regulatory T cells. So this is how we design it. So we have done already the phase 1 trials. So we demonstrated that the interleukin-2 mutant was much safer as compared to the interleukin-2 native protein. So it does not induce cytokine release syndrome or cytokine storm, as we saw yesterday, and the disease control rate was pretty encouraging, 50%, even though we were dealing with very advanced cancer population. And regarding the immune population that we were somehow stimulating, it were the effector T cells and the NK cells and not the regulatory T cells that somehow suppress the immune response. So I will skip this part. So I have to say that after 30 years, we have been, dealing with 20 different investigational drugs. So we're very proud to say that we have completed more than 200 clinical trials, and we have been working with 100 hospitals in Cuba, more than 120 polyclinics, which is the primary care attentions, as I have explained it, and 20,000 patients. So we're very happy and very proud of that. So this is our slogan, science is our voice to change the future and to overcome the silent despair. Thank you very much.
What we say about surprise, we want to be surprised. There was a lot of jaw-dropping moments, weren't there? For a small country to have so many breakthroughs, make so many discoveries. And I think very much the theme that came out from ECHE yesterday was about sharing. Sharing is caring. And so what an incredible, I want to tell the whole world. I want that presentation to be seen by everybody in cancer. What's that, Pirella? Oh, question.
It's just, first of all, outstanding work and excellent result. It speaks for itself. And I just was curious, aside from the hospital in the US, who it showed interest in, given the cost, prohibitive cost of some of these drugs, can you say if there is more interest in other countries who are also not a priority, let's say for some pharmaceutical companies? What are you working on? And what is your capacity, for example, to provide the drug? Are you having other collaborations to be able to make the EGFR drugs available?
Yes, for example, for the antibody, we do have another manufacturing facility in China, in Beijing, and another one in Thailand, by the way, to satisfy the needs. And for example, in the rest of the Latin American country, we can provide the antibody because the manufacturing capacity is roughly 50 kilograms of any recombinant protein. So we have to decide what to produce, either the original antibodies or the anti-PD-1 antibodies. So we need to continue invest. And for example, the challenge is how to make the clinical trials outside Cuba, because it is very costly, it is very expensive, so we cannot afford it. We're a very poor country. So, and this is prohibited for us. So the big pharma is the only one organizing the phase 3 studies, and provided that this is a Cuban drug, theoretically it will not be easy to be sold in the US. So even though the big pharma could be very interested in the Cuban drugs, they somehow are afraid of not to recovering the investment, and they are not willing to somehow developed this kind of drugs, even though they can save lives, as we know. So this is their challenge.
We have one more a question or response.
This was a fantastic presentation, and indeed, what a great contribution from your end to the country as well as to the world. Thank you. So my question to you was regarding the use of the EGF antibody in the primary care setting and give it to all comers. Yeah? So that is a pretty risky way to go. And I wanted to know from you, how many of them turned out to be EGF positive in their blood test, and how many of them responded? Because that is a very important kind of going ahead of the times that you have done there.
Yes, in the case of the vaccine, which is the one that we're using in the primary care setting, we have developed an in-house diagnostic tool, which is an ELISA method, which is a very easy to transfer to every municipality. And so we are only treating those patients in which the EGF is very high. So those are the one dependent, in which the tumors are indeed dependent on the EGF. And I would say that the effect of the vaccine is more like a cytostatic. So somehow we prevent the rapid progression of the disease. So what we care is about the extending survival, but also with the quality of life, because this is very important, as we have been discussing, because we are not hampering the quality of life. This is not like a chemotherapy, so there is no consequences regarding the quality of life because it is very safe. So it is like any vaccine. So it is mainly pain and injection site. So it is very important because we were dealing with advanced cancer patients, so they are somehow immunocompromised. So you have to keep giving them boosters every month or every 2 months. So it was more easy to grant the compliance because, it is not only a self-antigen, but these patients are somehow immunosuppressed on account of the cancer itself, but also on account of the previous chemotherapy. So we found that the better way to accomplish with the vaccine schedule was using in the primary care setting. So, and provided it is so safe, we do not need to administer them in the hospital, and the patients are coming back and forth from the primary care to the secondary care level to have the CT scans, and they have a joint evaluation between the family doctor and the oncologist every 3 months. So this is the way we do.
Do you have the disease-free survival?
Yes, it is easier to find, the survival data instead of the disease-free survival, because in Cuba, sometimes we have some problems. This is not disease-free survival itself. It is progression-free survival because they have an advanced cancer, so they are not disease-free. And believe it or not, in Cuba, sometimes it's difficult to have the periodic CT scans because we don't have the spare parts for the CT scan machine. So it is easy to measure the overall survival, apart from the progression-free survival, but the overall survival is pretty encouraging. And this is what we have somehow validated in the clinical trial in the US now.
We're going to go to one more response.
You might have covered it during your presentation, but I just wanted to know, you mentioned you have 20 investigational drug, right? So which means it's not FDA approved?
So
Oh, okay. I was
I'm
just
here. So,
trying to
I mean,
figure out where are you.
20. I mean, we have 20 in total. Among these 20 drugs, we have some of them which are approved, not only in Cuba, but outside. And those are not only innovative drugs, those are a combination between biosimilars, because
Okay.
we are producing basically biologics and innovative drugs. And provided that we can produce antibodies, we can do bispecific antibodies. And now we are trying to establish the CAR T cells, because as we learned it yesterday, I mean, what we need to do for the CAR T cells is to insert an antibody fragment into the T cell of the patient. So we are about to start into the CAR T cells issues. And provided you have realized that since we have this interleukin-2 mutant, we need to expand the CAR T cells before being injected to the patient. So we're about to start a CAR T cell trial in the US using the interleukin-2 mutant by ex vivo expanding the CAR T cells. So this is the approach. So 20, not originals. I would say 15 are innovative drugs and the rest are
Yeah, I just want
biosimilars.
to, the reason I asked this question, because for anything you want to bring it on license, you have to do a global trial, right? Because your trial, if you're specific to Cuba, then you cannot get it approved outside. So that's the main
Right.
reason. Yeah. So thank you.
Completely right.